Johnny Depp was born on June 9th, 1963, in the small working-class town of Owensboro, located in the heart of Kentucky, United States. Owensboro was not the kind of place where dreams of stardom and Hollywood glory typically began. It was a modest city nestled along the southern banks of the Ohio River, known more for its quiet suburban life and blue-collar spirit than for anything remotely related to film or fame. It was here, in this humble setting, that John Christopher Depp II came into the world, the boy who would one day become one of the most enigmatic and celebrated actors of his generation. From the very beginning, Johnny's life was far removed from the glitter of fame. His family was working class, grounded in the traditions and hardships of American life in the 1960s. His mother, Betty Sue Palmer, was a waitress, a tough and tireless woman who did what she could to support her children. She worked long shifts and often juggled multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Betty Sue was known for her fiery temper, her resilience, and her fierce loyalty to her family. She was not a woman who had it easy, but she was determined to survive, and to make sure her kids did too. Johnny's father, John Christopher Depp Sr., worked as a civil engineer. Unlike Betty Sue, he was a quiet, reserved man. Often emotionally distant, he didn't express much affection, and his relationship with his children, especially Johnny, was somewhat formal and strained. While he provided stability in terms of income, his presence at home was more muted. As Johnny would later recall, his father was not a source of warmth, but rather a figure of silence and distance. Still, John Sr. played a vital role in the structure of the household, even if emotionally he remained on the sidelines. Johnny was the youngest of four children, and growing up with three older siblings shaped much of his early social world. His siblings, Daniel, Debbie, and Christy, each had their own paths and personalities, and Johnny often found himself in the role of the baby of the family. Being the youngest meant he was sometimes sheltered, but it also meant he was constantly observing, watching the dynamics between his parents and siblings, absorbing the tension, the laughter, the noise, and the silence that define their family life. Despite the modest means and occasional turmoil, Johnny's early years were not without moments of warmth and connection. He had a close bond with his mother, who, despite her often harsh discipline, was also deeply protective of her children. Betty Sue had grown up with hardship and pain of her own, and she tried, in her own intense and uncompromising way, to prepare her children for the toughness of life. For Johnny, this translated into both love and confusion. He admired her strength, but he also feared her anger. The Depp household was far from calm. Arguments were frequent, particularly between Johnny's parents. The tension in the home was palpable, and Johnny learned from an early age how to navigate emotional minefields. He became a quiet observer, someone who paid attention to tone, to mood, to unspoken signals, a skill that would later serve him well as an actor. But in childhood, it created a sense of unease, a constant need to read the room and stay alert. Their economic situation was always precarious. The family moved frequently, even during Johnny's earliest years in Kentucky. This was not just a matter of changing neighborhoods. Sometimes it meant changing entire towns and states, as John Sr.'s work and financial challenges pulled the family from place to place. It was a transient existence, never quite settling long enough to build deep roots. This lack of permanence affected Johnny profoundly. Even before adolescence, he was already used to packing up, saying goodbye, and starting over. Home for Johnny was not a specific house or town. It was wherever the family happened to be, for now. In later interviews, Johnny would often reflect on these early years as formative in shaping his worldview. He didn't grow up with privilege. He grew up with real people, real problems, and real pain. He learned what it meant to stretch a dollar, to see a parent cry in private, to move again before getting too attached to anyone. He saw his parents struggle to keep the family afloat, often sacrificing their own emotional well-being in the process. The contrast between his upbringing and the glamorous world he would one day enter could not have been starker. But perhaps it was this grounding in reality, in working-class hardship, that gave Johnny Depp his edge, that quiet intensity, that unpredictable energy, and that deep well of emotion just below the surface. These were not the qualities of a polished Hollywood product. These were the qualities of someone who had lived, who had seen life up close, its beauty, its cruelty, its absurdity. In many ways, Johnny's early years in Owensboro planted the first seeds of the outsider he would become. He never quite fit in. Not at home, not in school, not in town. He was sensitive, introspective, often lost in thought. Even as a child, he had a rich internal world, one that would later become the playground for the many eccentric and soulful characters he portrayed on screen. And so the story of Johnny Depp, the world-famous actor, the artistic chameleon, the Hollywood rebel, began not with agents or studios or red carpets. It began in a small Kentucky town in a modest house, surrounded by siblings and struggling parents. It began with late-night arguments behind closed doors, with the quiet hum of a mother counting tips, with the silent presence of a father who didn't know how to express his love. It began with a boy who was already, in so many ways, preparing to transform pain into performance. One of the most defining aspects of Johnny Depp's early life was the constant relocation his family endured. While most children his age were building friendships, settling into their schools, and forming a sense of belonging, Johnny was packing his belongings and saying goodbye again. According to Depp himself, his family moved more than 20 times during his childhood. These moves spanned multiple towns and cities, primarily across Florida, after the family left Kentucky. Every move meant a new home, a new neighborhood, and, perhaps most difficult for a child, a new school. For someone craving connection and stability, it was emotionally taxing. Johnny never had the chance to build lasting friendships or feel rooted in any one place. As soon as he started to adjust, it was time to leave. This created an early and enduring sense of displacement, a feeling of being an outsider no matter where he went. On the surface, Johnny appeared quiet and reserved. But inside, the emotional toll of this lifestyle was building. He became increasingly introspective, uncertain, and disconnected from the world around him. Other children had birthday parties, weekend sleepovers, and lifelong friends. Johnny had the road, the boxes, the new schools, and the feeling of being the new kid over and over again. This feeling of not belonging often led to bullying and isolation. Kids teased him for being different, for the way he talked, the clothes he wore, or simply because he wasn't one of them. He stopped trying to fit in and learned to observe instead. He became incredibly good at reading people, sensing mood, emotion, and tension without needing to hear a word. It was a survival skill. Later in life, it would become one of his greatest artistic tools. The constant moving also exacerbated tensions within the family. These relocations weren't always planned. They were often reactions to lost jobs, money problems, or personal conflicts. The emotional pressure was high. Arguments became more frequent. Stability was something they couldn't hold on to for long. Johnny, even as a child, could feel the strain tightening around them. His mother, Betty Sue, did what she could to hold the family together, but she had a fiery temperament. Her love was fierce, but so was her anger. She was a survivor, shaped by her own difficult past, and she could be both nurturing and frightening. Johnny loved her deeply, but feared her outbursts. His father, in contrast, was emotionally withdrawn. He rarely intervened and offered little comfort or connection. The result was a household filled with emotional contradictions, intensity, silence, warmth, and volatility all at once. Caught between a mother who could be unpredictable and a father who was emotionally absent, Johnny learned to keep his emotions to himself. He internalized most of his pain. He retreated into his imagination. His guitar, given to him at age 12, became his escape. Music offered a safe space, a consistent rhythm in an otherwise chaotic world. It was something he could rely on, something that didn't change when everything else did. These early years also shaped Johnny's identity as an introvert, someone who preferred the company of his own thoughts. He began to build an internal world that felt safer than the one outside. That inner world, full of ideas, emotions, and fantasies, would one day evolve into the playground of his most memorable film characters. Interestingly, despite all the turmoil, this constant upheaval also taught him resilience. He learned how to adapt, how to blend in when needed, and how to remain invisible when necessary. He also developed a deep empathy for other outsiders, people who didn't fit in or felt like strangers in their own lives. That empathy would later guide his choice of roles: characters on the margins, misunderstood loners, and lovable oddballs. In many ways, the chaos of Johnny Depp's early life became the foundation of his future career. The instability that once caused pain gave him insight, emotional range, and artistic sensitivity. The boy who moved from town to town carrying emotional weight far beyond his years would one day channel that same weight into performances that touched millions. For Johnny Depp, home was not a place of comfort and warmth. It was often a place of conflict and contradiction. While many children look to their parents as a source of stability, Johnny's home life was marked by emotional volatility and an undercurrent of tension that was always present, even in moments of calm. His parents, Betty Sue Palmer and John Christopher Depp Sr., came from humble working-class backgrounds. They were products of their time, stoic, determined, and burdened by their own unresolved struggles. Betty Sue was a fierce and complex woman. She had endured a difficult upbringing and carried that pain with her into adulthood. She was known for her sharp tongue, her explosive temper, and her unpredictable mood swings. One moment she could be deeply loving and protective. The next she could erupt with anger or harsh criticism. Johnny often described her as the meanest human being he had ever met, while also calling her one of the most loving. That emotional duality, love laced with pain, left a lasting mark on him. He never knew which version of his mother he would encounter on any given day. And so, from a young age, he learned to walk on emotional eggshells, constantly alert, constantly managing the emotional landscape of the adults around him. His father, by contrast, was the opposite. John Sr. was quiet, emotionally reserved, and rarely engaged in confrontation. He seemed to carry the weight of his own dissatisfactions silently, without resolution or expression. When Betty Sue's emotions erupted, John Sr. would retreat, physically, emotionally, or both. He did not intervene, he did not comfort, he did not explain. In that silence, young Johnny felt alone. This imbalance, one parent overpowering, the other absent, created a confusing and painful dynamic. There was no model of healthy conflict resolution, no clear example of love expressed with gentleness, no reassurance that things would be okay, just the chaos of loud arguments, the silence of tension, and the growing awareness that something was deeply wrong. Everything changed dramatically when Johnny was 15 years old. One day, without warning, his father packed his bags and left. No final discussion, no family meeting, just gone. To young Johnny, this was devastating. It wasn't just the physical loss of a parent, it was the psychological blow of abandonment. Up to that point, even in his father's silence, there had been the illusion of stability. Now even that was gone. Johnny later recalled walking into the house and seeing his mother sitting on the couch, completely still, completely silent, trying to process what had just happened. It was a moment burned into his memory. He didn't understand it then, but that day marked a turning point. He felt an enormous weight placed on his shoulders. He had to grow up fast. He had to step into a role no 15-year-old should have to play. He became protective of his mother, even as their relationship remained emotionally complicated. He saw her sadness, her rage, her vulnerability. He also began to understand the fragility of adults, the reality that they too were broken in their own ways. This realization brought both pain and insight. It would later inform his deep portrayal of emotionally layered characters, men who carried hidden wounds, unresolved histories, and inner chaos. The trauma of his father's abandonment also planted a seed of trust issues that would follow Johnny throughout his adult relationships. He later admitted that he never truly got over his father's departure, and that the act of disappearing without explanation haunted him. The fear of being left behind, of people vanishing without reason, stayed with him for years. It bled into his personal relationships, his worldview, and his own self-worth. In time, Johnny would reconnect with his father, and he would even try to understand him. He came to see that his father's silence wasn't cruelty, but possibly fear, depression, or helplessness. But that understanding came much later. As a teenager, all he felt was betrayal and confusion. What's more, his mother's behavior didn't improve after the divorce. If anything, her emotional state grew more unstable. There were instances of physical and verbal abuse, and Johnny internalized much of the pain. He didn't talk about it. He didn't fight back. He escaped in other ways, through music, through fantasy, through artistic expression. The combination of parental conflict, abandonment, and emotional instability laid the groundwork for much of what would later become Johnny Depp's inner world. He became someone who trusted few, who felt safest in art and performance, and who could easily slip into the skin of wounded, misunderstood characters. His personal pain became his creative fuel. He once said, "My childhood was dark, very dark." And yet from that darkness emerged one of the most versatile and empathetic actors of his generation. The conflict he witnessed wasn't just a background detail, it was a central force in shaping who he would become, both as an artist and as a man. School for Johnny Depp was never a place of inspiration or personal growth. Quite the opposite. It was a source of frustration, boredom, and alienation. From an early age, he found it hard to fit into the rigid structure of academic life. The traditional classroom environment, with its rules, schedules, and expectations, seemed entirely disconnected from how his mind worked or what he cared about. He wasn't a poor student because he lacked intelligence, quite the contrary. But Johnny simply didn't connect with the system. While some students found comfort in textbooks, lectures, and exams, Johnny found them stifling. He struggled with authority, and not in a defiant way at first, but more from a growing sense that he didn't belong in a place that tried to shape everyone into the same mold. As he moved from school to school, thanks to his family's constant relocations, this disconnection only deepened. Every new school brought new rules, new expectations, and new teachers who didn't understand him. He didn't stay long enough in any one place to develop a real relationship with his teachers or classmates. Instead, he became increasingly isolated, internal, and resentful of the system that seemed more interested in control than creativity. By the time he reached high school, the struggle had grown into rebellion. He began skipping classes, getting into trouble, and challenging authority figures. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be cool. He was simply disillusioned. The school environment felt irrelevant to the world he lived in. There was no space for music, no validation for creativity, no encouragement for kids who saw things differently. He once described feeling like a square peg in a round hole. The more he tried to fit in, the more out of place he felt. He wasn't interested in algebra or history lectures. He was interested in sound, emotion, stories, and freedom. School, in his eyes, was a place that tried to dull the edges, to homogenize individuality, and to prepare kids for a life he didn't want. There were also disciplinary issues, though nothing extreme. He wasn't violent or dangerous, but he was frequently at odds with the system, arguing with teachers, refusing to participate, disappearing from classes. His appearance, longer hair, a quiet defiance in his posture, set him apart from his peers, many of whom followed the rules just to avoid trouble. Johnny was never afraid of trouble. What scared him more was the idea of spending his life doing something meaningless. By the age of 16, he had enough. He dropped out of school with his mother's permission. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion. It was more like an escape. Betty Sue, recognizing her son's unhappiness and his artistic nature, supported his decision. She believed in his talent, even if she didn't fully understand it. That gesture of trust meant everything to Johnny. It was a moment of validation, proof that someone saw more in him than just a failing student. Leaving school didn't mean he had a clear plan. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do next. But what he did know was that he couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. He couldn't continue sitting in classrooms that drained him or taking tests that meant nothing to him. The normal world, with its schedules and routines, never made sense to him, and now, finally, he was free from it. But freedom came with its own challenges. He was young, directionless, and navigating a world where people expected you to choose a path, pick a career, and settle down. Johnny didn't want any of that. He didn't want to settle into anything. What he craved was expression, and for the moment that expression would come through music. Dropping out of school was more than just a rejection of academics. It was a symbolic moment, a line drawn in the sand. Johnny had chosen his own path, even if it was uncertain. And though that decision might have looked reckless from the outside, it was actually the beginning of a deeper journey toward discovering who he truly was.